Now let's talk about death, taxes, net zero. Whether you like it or not, all three of those things are going to happen for all the obvious reasons. And as you know, there was a rather definitive debate about net zero targets in the 2019 election. So let's get back in the Wayback Machine, because there's a point that the Labor Party might be missing with the politics that they are playing today after the government, well, it's had its conversion on the road to Damascus, and it too is now part of Net Zero 2050. The climate policy released by Bill Shorten in 2019 was absolute. The climate policy said they would cut their emissions, Australia's emissions, by 45% by 2030, net zero by 2050, and 50% of renewable energy would be in place across Australia if Bill Shorten became Prime Minister a couple of years ago. But the question that, of course, Bill Shorten or any of the advocates couldn't answer at the time was, yeah, great, but how much does it cost? He had no answer. So this is the best that his spin machine could come up with.
Fairness and decency.
You're not answering the question, Mr. Shorten.
Oh, OK. I'm going to give someone else a go.
Answer the question. When can people know?
Dan.
When can people know, Mr. Shorten, the cost of the economy? You didn't answer the question.
Do you know what, John?
And you're not answering the question.
Dan.
When can people expect to know, Mr. Shorten, the cost of the economy?
All right, Dan.
Why can't you answer the question, Mr. Shorten?
Because I'm going to give your colleagues half a go.
It was a definitive moment. And it was obvious that the Never Never target either had a massive number or nobody knew, and people didn't trust it, so they went, you know what, I'm out. We'll stick with the ones that we currently have. After losing not just that election, but a climate election where they had exactly the same promise in 2016, where, of course, they lost government in 2013, where they were dragged to a draw in 2010, Labor decided to change its spots, this time under a lefty leader of the Labor Party, Each-Way Albo. He said that the 45% emissions target for 2030 was a mistake. So the climate policy today of the Labor Party is one of the three things that they took to the last election. No promise about exactly how much of the grid will be renewable by 2030, and no statement when it comes to 2030 about how many emissions they plan to cut. Instead, the only policy that they have going into this next election is exactly the same policy that the government has: net zero by 2050. Now, Anthony Albanese, obviously feeling hurt about how successful the line that the government ran against Bill Shorten and the policies, decided to turn up the heat on the Prime Minister today, essentially reversing the question back onto him about the cost of net zero by 2050. And Albo thought he was very clever today.
Will the Prime Minister release government modelling on the impacts of net zero emissions by 2050 presented to the Nationals party room?
Has the Minister seen any modelling which shows the economic impact of net zero by 2050 for the regions? And I refer to his previous answer regarding the modelling of net zero by 2050 on regions in which he said, and I quote, it has an impact on the price of commodities.
Morrison has said he's going to Glasgow, but what's he going to go to Glasgow with?
So what is the impact on the economy of a net zero emissions target by 2050?
Now, these are all fair questions, but they can't answer them themselves. So we have this bizarre scenario where, because of the loudest voices and the people who run the world, we're going to sign up to something that no one knows what its cost is. All we know is that there is a cost of transition. The polling always says that as soon as there's a dollar value attached, then people's opinions change about whether we should go with the motherhood statement. But it's very fair to say there's probably no one in the federal parliament, upper house or lower house, will still be serving by 2050, so who cares? Tick and flick. Essentially, both sides agree on the headline number, but the difference is about how serious they are about the headline number. Albo promises to put it into legislation, doesn't rule out things like ETSs and obviously potential prices on carbon, which of course is an obvious cost to directly polluters but also to customers. The federal government says we'll get there via technology, but we've got a very long time to get there. Because here is the unspoken truth about the net zero targets. I don't care about 2050 because there is a deal in place that locks Australia into 2030. That's the Paris Agreement. Both sides of politics support the Paris Agreement. But only one side of politics has an actual target for 2030. Is it the Labor Party? No, it's the government. In fact, Albo knows that the question mark of how much would it cost before 2030 can be difficult to answer. But they have gone from 45% emission target by 2030, a promise of 50% renewable energy by 2030, to exactly the same policy as the federal government that won't answer the question about how much it costs because Labor doesn't know how much it costs either. So effectively, he's attacking his own policy. But here he was, walking away from any commitment about 2030, unlike the one that's already passed the Parliament and that the federal government will achieve.
What's wrong with you just saying now, which you've been reluctant to do in recent days, we are sticking to this 45% reduction target by 2030? Why are you afraid of endorsing that target you took to the election?
That was in 2015. That was a 2015 target established for 15 years' time. Guess what, Andrew? There's no TARDIS. I can't go back in time. You can't define what your point is in terms of where you'll go to the election in 2022, at the beginning, in January 2020, because the circumstances will change.
Each way Albo. By the way, it's not their policy from 2015, it was their policy from 2019. As for the government, their position on climate change is 2030 targets before you unlock everything about 2050. And they will meet it with no carbon tax and no change to the way that we currently live.
The world knows what our 2030 commitments are. We signed up to them. I took them to the election, at the last election, Mr Speaker, and the Australian people endorsed them. I said we'd meet them and we'd beat them. And we will meet them and we will beat them.
So, again, the problem for Albo is that while he thinks he's a very clever little boy, by asking the same questions of the government that they could not answer in opposition, that they still can't answer in opposition, they're effectively criticising their own policy. And the drag from the left is not even about 2050. It's about doing even more than the evil Liberals, who are the only major party promising something about 2030 because it's already been passed in law. Let me show you, again in the Turnbull Times. Their suggestion is that no change to Australia's 2030 emissions reduction target, as Scott Morrison focuses on the road to net zero. You see, they have highlighted 2030 as being the time for massive mega action, not 2050. And whatever concern you might have about the sliding scale and changes in policy when it comes to the federal government, if you got rid of the current federal government, you would replace them with the Labor Party, who is promising to put the accelerator on the race to 2050 with no promise about 2030. Instead, the types of things that are being fed into the ecosystem that is the left in our country, that makes up so much of the membership and is the leadership of the Labor Party, well, it says that Australia needs to cut by at least 50% its 2030 targets to meet Paris. And Labor have started to show some signals here. We can't begin at 2049. Chris Bowen, the new climate change guy, says Labor signals more ambitious target for emissions cuts. So the question isn't what is the government's position on 2050, it is what the hell is Labor's on 2030? Do they agree with the current rule of government, which will meet the targets, or do they agree with the Guardian worldview that we've got to do twice as much between now and 2030? So here's the three problems for the Labor Party. Do you match the government on the 2030 targets? Which essentially means both sides are exactly the same. There is no up and there is no down on climate change for either party that will form government at the next election. Do you outdo the government on its 2030 targets, which will mean more aggressive and thus more destructive economic results of policies? Or do you do less than the government to avoid the economic consequences, but then end up getting outflanked by the government on action for climate change. That's the game. Don't get distracted by the people who want to pretend it's only about 2050. Death taxes, net zero 2050. I don't love it either, but it's happening. But politically speaking, the difference between Team Red and Team Blue is 2030. It's about how much, how far. You know where the government is. It's exactly where they were in 2019. It's no difference. The change in policy is about 2030 to 2050, not 2021 or 22 to 2030. It's the Labor Party that's changed when it comes to 2030, and the left wants them to do twice as much as the government currently does. Each way Albo thought he was very clever today, but it was a massive own goal because he can't answer his own question. It's a trap that he has fallen into. It's one that'll take a while for the penny to drop in the press gallery, who think it's all about the fight for 2050, when the reality is the fight at the next election, if there is to be one, is going to be about 2030. A fight that is exactly the same fight as 2019. And for his part, Bill Shorten, the alternative leader of the Labor Party, who's always just here to help, well, he has learnt no lessons from when he lost in 2016 or 2019, and when inevitably he wants to put himself up again either at this next election or the one after that. And there are, unbelievably, are people who saw his stupidity last time who are sort of soft pushing him as the alternative to defeat the current government. This was his hot take today, where he was focused on talking to a very, very small group of Australians with one of his zingers that did so well last time.
At the moment, you'd have to draw the conclusion that the coalition between the Nats and the Liberals is a very unhappy marriage. It's become like the Squid Games of Australian politics, except without the nice tracksuit.
Oh, Squid Game! Did you hear it? Ha 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 ha! Squid Game is a very successful show on Netflix, but the majority of Australians haven't seen it. The cool kids have seen it, the Twitter kids have seen it, everyone on telly's seen it, but normal people, they were watching The Block. Well done, Bill. They won't run with your targets and they won't run with your zingers. And the other alternative is the bloke who scored own goal, own goal, own goal, own goal today, while setting himself up for an impossible fight on 2030.